Jessica Zimmerman Graf, the senior rabbi here at Congregation Sherith Israel. We started this series just about almost 51 weeks ago now at the beginning of the pandemic to be an opportunity for us to look at what's happening in our complicated world and bring it a little closer to home so that we can connect our social values and our understanding of the world and look at those through a Jewish lens. So these conversations about current events and politics and the pandemic and racism, anti-racism, all these things have been wonderful opportunities for us to engage in sometimes heated debate, always interesting discussion, and tonight will be no exception. I'm delighted to welcome you all. Want to introduce first Michael Gaines, who many of you may know from his various leadership roles in our community or in the San Francisco community. He is a criminal defense attorney and has been in California for decades, and happily for us has been at Congregation Sherith Israel for decades as well. Most importantly, he's a member of our board of trustees here at Congregation Sherith Israel. He's on the Hills of Eternity board, taking good care of our congregation cemetery, and he's a really great guy. So Michael, thank you for your help in bringing our wonderful speakers together tonight for this conversation, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is really an exciting evening. I'd like to talk first about the person who's going to be doing the interviewing of Chesa Boudin, Warren Braunig. Little bit about Warren. Warren's a lawyer. He is a partner at Kecker, Van Nest, and Peters law firm in San Francisco. He's a partner in that firm, and he's also the partner and husband of the president of the board of trustees at Sherith Israel, Lindsay Braunig. Warren is a member of the board of directors of the Hills of Eternity Cemetery Board. I noticed that he graduated with the highest honors from NYU Law School, which I attended. His law practice focuses on intellectual property, but it runs the gamut of complex commercial litigation. But in the area of criminal justice, which is sort of the theme of our evening, he is currently working with the ACLU in a pro bono effort to end New Mexico's use of punishing high bail to incarcerate nonviolent indigent defendants so that they are forced to remain in custody pending a trial. Now, there is a connection between our guest tonight and Warren. They were actually, the Kecker firm sent Warren to the DA's office to get some experience in trying cases for 3 months to get some trial experiences doing misdemeanor cases. And who was one of his adversaries on the defense side? None other than Chesa Boudin, then a newly hired public defender toiling at the Hall of Justice in misdemeanor court. And now to Chesa. I remember first noticing him at the Hall of Justice. He was a young public defender at the podium. This is like a snapshot for me. He was with his client dressed in orange jail garb. I don't recall the issue, but it was clearly an issue that Chesa Boudin felt strongly about. You couldn't help but notice him, but he wasn't strident and he wasn't overwrought. He wasn't artless. He was just effective and he was well-spoken. And I was sitting with my wife, Betsy Wolkin, who was also a criminal defense attorney, and we're sitting there waiting to get our respective cases called. And I asked her, I said, who is this guy? And she told me, well, that's Chesa Boudin. And from that point on, time permitting, whenever he and I had matters in the same courtroom, I would wait around to see him handle his business. Ultimately, I walked up and I introduced myself. I was impressed. And he said, of course I know you. And he was such a gentleman and he was so young. And it wasn't long after some years in the PD's office that he got the novel idea to cross the aisle and run for district attorney of the county of San Francisco. And to say this was a bold move is putting it mildly. Our former district attorney, George Gascon, suddenly retired without warning. And Chesa Boudin's ultimate opponent in the election, Susie Loftus, was appointed by the Mayor Breed as the interim DA, so that Ms. Loftus could run as an incumbent to increase her chances of victory. But Chesa's campaign had traction based on the progressive vision of what a DA's office could and should be, and he won. And I supported him in large part because of those snapshots that I told you about, those moments when I watched him in the court defending indigent people. And I'm sure tonight we will hear not only about Chesa's vision for the implementation of policies of restorative justice, for bail reform and rehabilitation, treatment and education in lieu of punishing incarceration. But in balance, people have to understand, make no mistake, Mr. Boudin's office is an office that prosecutes people who are charged with public offenses. And he has at his disposal a number of able and talented trial lawyers. Take it from me, I know. They are able and willing and encouraged to prosecute repeat offenders of violent felonies. After all, it is a matter of policy that outreach and concern for the needs of victims is a prime directive of this office. And it's a policy I've become familiar with and observed in my work as defense counsel. So in keeping in line with this wonderful tradition of frontline speakers, this is a rich tradition that we have here, rich and varied. And with the assistance of Warren Braunig, we are in for a special evening tonight. And so we welcome San Francisco's elected district attorney, Chesa Boudin.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Warren, of course, for being here. And let me just say, it is such a privilege to be with all of you. I see so many people I know from many different walks of life, part of my community, part of San Francisco's community. I see mentors and friends. I see the parents of friends. I see staff members that work in my office. And I see the diversity and richness that makes San Francisco such a wonderful place to call home. I know that we have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure to focus our time on questions. But let me just start, if I may, with a little bit of context about my own experience as a Jew and with Judaism. You know, there's a quote that Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously had on the wall of her chambers, a quote that comes from Deuteronomy: "Justice, justice shall you pursue." Now, I think that quote is in many ways something that has been at the center of my life's purpose, and in many ways a central facet of the Jewish identity. It's one of the most fundamental concepts in Judaism, the pursuit of justice. I believe that in everything we learn from our culture and our faith and our community, we are told to pursue justice, to go after it, not to wait until it confronts you, not to wait until it's too late. Social justice in Judaism is a concept that has really led Jews across the world to be at the forefront of civil rights movements, of national liberation struggles, from South Africa to the Deep South. You name it, Jews have been at the forefront of putting their lives and their well-being on the line for justice. And it comes as well from, I think, a concept that's often referred to as tikkun olam, right? This need to repair the world. And we understand that in a way that some communities simply don't, because of our experience with oppression, because of our experience with stigma and with xenophobia against us, simply because of our cultural traditions and our faith. You know, the fact that our people and our ancestors experienced 400 years of Egyptian exile, including 210 years of slavery, is a critical part of our personality, of our culture as a community. And it's one that leads us to have compassion and concern for our fellow man and woman in a way that some communities simply do not. It's, I think, something that has informed the critical role that Jews have and continue to play in the world when it comes to advocating for social justice. I believe that the concept of tzedakah, which is often, I think, perhaps mistranslated as charity, is really something broader. It's really the pursuit of social justice. And I know as we look forward to the holidays ahead, Purim, a fun holiday, and Passover, which is just 4 weeks from this Saturday, we have a lot to celebrate about our shared history. And I want to just wrap up this introduction by saying that my memories as a child of celebrating Passover, of searching for the Afikomen, were in my mother's prison visiting room. As many of you know, I grew up visiting my own parents in prison. Both of my biological parents are Jewish. My father remains incarcerated today at the age of 76 years old. And my mother did 22 years in prison from the time I was an infant. I don't mention that because of a request or desire for sympathy for them or for me, but rather to say, since before I can remember thinking, I have been directly impacted. My life has been shaped by our society's approach to crime and punishment. And my earliest memories of Passover are in my mother's prison visiting room, celebrating that family tradition, that community and cultural tradition with her and other women who were quite literally incarcerated inside prison gates. In order to go and sit down and break matzah and search for the Afikomen, we had to go through metal detectors and steel bars. That was my childhood. It has shaped who I am the same way that those 210 years of slavery, 400 years of exile shaped who we are as a people. And I know that like all Jews, we have a moral imperative to do justice, to seek justice, and to exercise mercy in our relationships with those who are less fortunate than us. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation tonight.
Thank you, District Attorney Boudin, and thank you for being here tonight with us and our virtual community. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Michael, for the wonderful introduction to both of us. And you answered what was going to be one of my first questions, and I really appreciate those remarks. I thought that's really very moving and very true to my concept of both Judaism and criminal justice. So thank you. I wanted to start by asking you, you've been described along with Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Fox in Chicago as a, quote, progressive district attorney, close quote. And I'm wondering, what does it mean to be a progressive district attorney?
Well, thank you for that question, Warren. I think, like any label, the more it's used, the more it becomes watered down and diluted. I want to answer the question by quoting from a friend of mine who ran for district attorney in Queens, a young queer Latina named Tiffany Caban. And she said that to be a progressive prosecutor at core really means to be a decarceral prosecutor. In other words, a prosecutor who recognizes that we can build safety through decarceration. Not that you need to be an abolitionist and I don't identify as an abolitionist. I believe there are people who we need to put in jail or prison. But I also believe that we are safer as a community when we don't rely on jails and prisons as a primary response to social problems like mental illness, like poverty, like homelessness. And if instead we reserve incarceration for people who have proven themselves to be truly violent and violent in ways that are unmitigable by other forms of intervention. You look at the United States and you compare it to other countries. We have 25% of the world's prisoners in this country. That approach, right? That approach, sending people to prison for life for things like stealing a pizza, for things like shoplifting from Safeway, right? Things that we have done in massive scale in this country, in ways that no other civilized country in the history of the world has done. Those approaches have bankrupted state and local governments. They have come to define who we are as a country, and they have not made us more safe. And not to put too fine a point on it, but let me be very precise. The experience that I had as a child growing up, visiting my parents in prison, it was a unique experience amongst my peers whose bar and bat mitzvahs I celebrated every single weekend of my 7th grade year in school. But it is not a unique experience in this country. In America, in today's America, the majority of adults have an immediate family member who is either currently or formerly incarcerated. That is not the kind of culture we should have. It does not build safety the ways that investment upstream in mental health treatment, in housing, in education, and access to healthcare can build true community safety. That's what it means to be a progressive prosecutor, to get at the root causes of crime.
Thank you, and I think that was very helpful. One of the first things that you did, consistent with that approach, when you became district attorney of this city and county, was to end the process of seeking cash bail for people awaiting trial. And I'd like to hear you talk about why that was one of the first things you did. But I also think I'd like you to address sort of the flip side of that, which is, as you alluded to, there are times and there are certain individuals who pose a threat to public safety and need to be incarcerated prior to trial. And so the question, I think, is both sort of why was that a priority for you, but also how do you make determinations about, and how do you think the decision should be made about who should be incarcerated pre-trial, and who should be making that decision?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Warren. It's one that gets at the heart of the criminal justice process, and also the work that led me, as Michael Gaines described at the beginning, to make this leap from being a public defender advocating for one person at a time as my clients, to thinking about systemic change and ultimately to run for the office I'm now privileged enough and honored enough to hold. For folks who aren't familiar with money bail, let me just start by explaining in really broad terms how it works, and then I'll talk about why we changed it and what we replaced it with. Money bail is a system in which people who are arrested can go to a commercial bail bond agent, pay a 10% non-refundable fee, and be immediately released from custody. That's basically how it works. Only the United States and the Philippines, out of all the countries in the world, have a for-profit bail industry. Here's the problem with money bail. First of all, it undermines public safety by allowing wealthy people who are dangerous to buy their way out without regard to the strength of the evidence against them or the danger they may pose. Second of all, money bail undermines the promise of equal protection under law. It makes a mockery of one of our core constitutional values. And it does that by detaining people in jail simply based on their poverty. So what we've done in San Francisco, one of my very first acts as district attorney, was to replace a wealth-based system of detention with a risk-based system of detention. In my district attorney's office, the amount of money someone has in the bank account makes no difference in whether or not they're held in custody pending trial. We have a presumption of innocence. We have a presumption of liberty. And if we're going to interrupt those presumptions and ask the court to hold someone behind bars pending trial, it is not going to be because they're poor. It's going to be because we believe they present such a serious public safety risk that there are no non-monetary conditions short of pretrial detention that can reasonably protect the government interest in their case.
And what does that mean to be so dangerous that they, pose such a danger that you would support keeping people locked up pending trial? How do you make that determination?
We have a number of different factors we use. It's not a simple formula. The short answer, Warren, is it's a very difficult determination. And we have cases, tragic cases, where people who are released end up committing serious crimes. Sometimes, as we've seen this year, a couple of vehicular manslaughters, 3 to be precise, were caused by people who had been released, not just by my office, but by other jurisdictions as well. We do not have crystal balls in our work. We don't have the benefit of Monday morning quarterbacking to make these decisions. And so the reality is we know that some number of people who are released from custody in San Francisco and in state prison and in every county across this state will go on to commit serious crimes. We know that, just as surely as we know that tens of thousands of Americans will die this year from car collisions or from lung cancer from smoking. We do our best in every single case to look at the facts, to look at the criminal history, to look at the charges and the strength of the evidence, to look at the reentry or release plan if we are considering releasing someone. And then we make our argument to the court, and ultimately the court decides. Now, there are a couple categories of charges where we are far more likely to seek detention. And those categories include what you would expect: violent crimes. When people are charged with murder or attempted murder or rape or armed robbery, those kinds of charges, assault with a deadly weapon, particularly when the suspect has, or the defendant has, a serious criminal history and we see a track record. Those are the kinds of cases where we are far more likely to seek detention. On the other hand, when someone is charged only with or has a history only of property crimes or drug addiction, instead of pretrial detention, at least in the first instance, what we prefer and what I believe is consistent with the Constitution is to seek conditions of release, non-monetary conditions, so that instead of money bail, allowing people to buy their way out, we are requiring them to engage with drug treatment or to check in with a case manager or to be compliant with the terms of a medical plan set forth by a psychiatrist. Those kinds of non-monetary conditions for people who don't obviously present a serious risk of violence are how we can improve public safety, decrease our reliance on jails, and in the process, save critical resources that can be invested in crime prevention and victim services.
You mentioned, and thank you for that answer. You mentioned the tragic case earlier this year where a parolee who was, my understanding is arrested twice for auto theft in San Francisco, released pre-trial, stole a third car, and sadly, tragically crashed it into two pedestrians, killing them. You took a lot of heat in the press and from some corners for that fact. I guess my question for you is, recognizing that you don't have a crystal ball and you can't know, do experiences like that call into question the way that decisions are being made about who to hold pre-trial, or do they change? Have they influenced the process that your office is undertaking?
So the short answer is yes, of course. I mean, a tragedy like that, put aside the way it was covered in the press, I personally met with the families of both women killed. There have been a lot of meetings that I've had over the course of this job, over the course of the last year, with the next of kin of homicide victims. But those two meetings stand out as among the most difficult things I've ever had to do, to talk to those families in pain, to speak with Hanneke Abe's mother through an interpreter and see the anguish and try and explain to her why her daughter was no longer with us. That experience is something that kept me awake at night, night after night after night, thinking about what we could have done differently to prevent this. And Warren, part of the challenge of this job, like any policymaking job, but particularly when it comes to criminal justice, is making policy based on data and based on the conduct and cases that fall into the heartland of what we do every day. We know that the cases that capture the headlines, that stand out in people's mind as defining moments of criminal justice policy, are actually outliers, right? The things that are normal don't make the headlines. They don't get reported. And so when we release someone charged with stealing a car, and because we release them, they're able to keep their job, they're able to avoid losing their housing, they're able to keep custody of their kids, and they don't get arrested again, and they come back to court and they pay restitution and they take responsibility for what they did and they turn their lives around. No one is ever going to write that story up in the press. None of you will ever read about it on the headlines of the San Francisco Chronicle or see it in the 7 o'clock news. It's never going to happen. What will happen is every time something goes wrong, especially if it goes wrong in the kind of tragic, horrific way that it went wrong on New Year's Eve, you will hear about it, and you'll hear about it day after day. You'll hear about it so much and so intensely that it will come to define the way that we all think about what happens in my office and in the Hall of Justice. So the challenge for me, like anybody in my shoes, is to make good policy based on what happens every day. And I'll tell you what happens every day. The lawyers in my intake unit, who between them have over 100 years of criminal justice practice experience, review police investigations, and they make decisions, hundreds of them a week, about whether or not to file charges and about whether or not to seek detention against the people who we are prosecuting. And they make those decisions based on their experience, based on the strength of the evidence, and based on the law, and based on what they've seen day in, day out. Sometimes that mundane, boring work results in criminal charges being filed. Sometimes, as in Mr. McAllister's case, the one we're talking about, it results in us asking police for further investigation or referring the case to another supervising agency like parole or probation to intervene. Most of the time, no one pays attention. And we need to continue making those decisions, and we need to do them better. We need to be ever more cautious and ever more intentional about the trade-offs and the risks and the decisions we make. We have made a number of concrete policy changes as a result of that tragedy, and there'll be more being announced in the weeks ahead.
Thank you, Chesa. I want to shift gears just a little bit. We are a city that has so much wealth and privilege within our 49 square miles. But when you walk through a neighborhood like the Tenderloin, it's almost overwhelming, the poverty and the despair there. People are selling and using drugs openly in what appears to be a consequence-free environment. You don't see a police presence there. We had 700 overdose deaths in San Francisco last year, which is an almost unthinkable tragedy. My question for you is, do you think that we have a moral obligation to aggressively go after people who are peddling opioids and methamphetamine and fentanyl, which is an opioid, but all of these drugs that are killing people on our streets, killing our citizens right now? Do we have an obligation to try to stop them? And why does it seem to so many people? And I hear this from a lot of people. Why does it seem like the DA's office isn't making that a priority?
Warren, there is in some ways no bigger tragedy than the one you've just described. As much as our lives in this past year have been dominated day in, day out by the COVID-19 pandemic, more than twice the number of people died from fentanyl overdoses in San Francisco than died from COVID-19 in 2020. It is taking lives every single day. And these are lives lost that are preventable. We know how to prevent these overdoses, but we've got to implement policy more effectively. So let me talk about the role my office plays and my vision for doing a better job with this issue. First of all, we prosecute drug sales and possession for sales cases at a higher rate than any other category of crime the police bring us. Nearly 80% of arrests presented to my office for felony drugs cases are filed as felony criminal cases. There's no other category of case with that high a filing rate. It's also true that, as you'd expect, given the statistic I just told you, the single most common category of open case in my felony team's caseload, more than robbery or burglary or sexual assault, the single most common category of case we have open today is drug sales or possession for sale. So the notion that we're not doing anything is simply false, and it is demonstrably false if you look at the evidence, or if you do, as Michael described in his introduction, go into the courtrooms of the Hall of Justice and look at the cases that are on the court calendar. You will see a huge volume of cases where we are prosecuting people for selling drugs. Here's the problem. It's not working. It's not working for many of the same reasons that the war on drugs has failed to work from coast to coast, from south to north, every city and town in this country where it's been tried for decades. It doesn't work because as soon as police arrest and we prosecute people, they are replaced on the street corners the next day. It doesn't work because we're not effectively disrupting the chain that brings drugs from Mexico and other parts of the world into California and up to Sacramento and across into the Bay Area and onto the streets of Soma and the Tenderloin. Our arrests and prosecutions of low-level drug dealers are simply ineffective. That's what we're doing. We're going to keep doing it. I'm not going to give up, but we're trying to do more and do better. So let me talk about what that looks like. It looks like a three-pronged approach. First of all, to prevent overdoses and connect people who are suffering from drug addiction with harm reduction, life-saving services, we need safe consumption sites. I'm proud that San Francisco's own State Senator Scott Wiener has legislation this year, which I support, which would allow us to create a safe consumption site. People do not die of overdoses in safe consumption sites, period. That's the first thing we need to do to save lives immediately and address the demand for drugs through harm reduction. Second of all, we need, again, a public health approach to a public health problem. We need treatment on demand for everyone in San Francisco who is battling addiction. It is unacceptable that in this city, in this day and age, with our values, with our resources, with our technology, it is easier to get high than it is to get help. But that's the reality on the streets of the Tenderloin and Soma. We've got to change that through treatment on demand. And third, this is where my office comes in. We need a much more effective approach to law enforcement. We cannot simply, in the DA's office, sit on our heels and wait for police to bring us people off the street corners who are low-level dealers. We've got to work our way upstream, and we've got to think about legislative and policy fixes that can address this problem. So to that end, I'm proud to announce that in my budget proposal this year, which was just submitted this week to the mayor, we are asking to create a fentanyl task force. It would have 10 staff members, 6 attorneys, 2 sentencing planners, and 2 investigators. The sentencing planners will work to ensure sentencing approaches that recognize people's substance abuse issues, as well as the fact that some of the people selling drugs in San Francisco have themselves been victims of human trafficking. The investigators will help us work upstream across the Bay to build cases that actually get large volumes of drugs off the street, so we're not just dealing with crumbs. And the attorneys will handle everything from charging to prosecution to policy initiatives and legislative drafting, so that we're doing more than passively waiting for police to bring us cases and try something that we know has been tried and failed across the country. So I hope you all will support our request for a fentanyl task force from City Hall in this budget season.
Thank you. Thanks. And I couldn't agree more that the war on drugs has been an epic failure nationwide and locally. And it is imperative, I think, to try to find creative solutions to get at the problem. One of those creative solutions in San Francisco in the past year has been City Attorney Dennis Herrera filing lawsuits against repeat drug offenders, lawsuits against repeat drug offenders as a public nuisance, and seeking to enjoin them from the 50-block radius that more or less is the Tenderloin. I'm wondering whether you think that is a useful complementary approach to the things that you are trying to do, and whether you support that.
I consider Dennis Herrera a friend. He's obviously a colleague. There are lots of areas where we work together collaboratively on a range of issues. We have sort of overlapping jurisdiction on lots of things. And I very much hope that his initiative around these injunctions that you referenced will be successful. We need something to work. And so whenever anyone steps up to the plate and tries to address a problem as serious and long lasting as this one, I hope for their success. I'm not optimistic about this particular initiative doing anything at all to change what we see in the Tenderloin and the Mission and Soma for a number of reasons. One is the injunction that the city attorney has sought is against a list of people, a list of individuals who are known drug sellers. And by definition, every single one of those people on his list are already facing felony charges from my office. You don't get on the city attorney injunction list unless you are already being prosecuted for felony drug sales. Now, here's the problem. if prosecuting them for felonies is ineffective, which in some cases, obviously it is, I don't know why we would expect the risk of a misdemeanor violation of an injunction to be a more effective deterrent. It won't be. It hasn't been. There's another aspect of it, which is the stay away order that you mentioned. And when someone is subject to an injunction, they are prohibited from entering the target area, in this case, the tenderloin. But again, the violation, the penalty for violating that order is a misdemeanor, and they're already facing felonies, which are more serious. But here's the other thing that's important for people to know. In every one of the hundreds of drug cases that my office files every year, at the first court appearance, what we call arraignment, we ask for a stay away order. And the court invariably signs a stay away order, an order prohibiting the defendant from going within 150 yards of the area where they were observed selling drugs or arrested in possession of drugs. So it's duplicative in the sense that we already have those stay away orders. We already have the ability to file new criminal charges if those orders are violated. And the third part, as I understand this injunction that is arguably different or better than what we're already doing, is that it allows to the city attorney to seek asset forfeiture of ill-gotten gains of drug proceeds. We already have an asset forfeiture attorney in my office. We already regularly seek forfeiture of proceeds from drug sales that are seized by police. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people selling drugs on the streets of San Francisco don't have bank accounts that we're going to go after. The cash they have on them when they're arrested is already being forfeited. And these are not folks who have assets in their name in deeds of trust or title to a car. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm dubious that this is going to do anything. And I think if you look at the streets of the Tenderloin in the 4 or 5 months since this initiative was announced, I think you see they've stayed pretty much the same. That being said, again, I wish the city attorney success, and I'm always willing to partner with folks who have creative ideas about a very intractable problem.
Do you think that, you know, when you're up for re-election in 3 years, 2.5 years, you should be judged on, you know, whether or not we're finally making some headway in the Tenderloin? I mean, if things are getting worse and not better at the end of the day, do you think that's something you should be held accountable for?
You know, I think when it comes to the war on drugs, it's not a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention that using traditional policing and prosecution strategies is not effective. So the tools that I have, that my office has, the short answer is no, they're not really related to what's at the root of this problem. If we are serious about solving this problem, we need to be serious about a public health approach. So I think if the city is willing to invest in the public health approaches that we know save lives and that we know work in places like Portugal and Canada and beyond, then we'll see a big difference. And until then, no matter how many people I prosecute, no matter how many young men of color we send to prison for selling drugs, as we have done for decades in this country, we will not solve the problems that we see on our streets.
I want to thank you for that. Oh, I'm getting an echo now. Thank you for that answer. And I want to shift to a new topic, which is property crime. And property crime is something that just feels epidemic in this city. The smash and grabs, recently garage break-ins seem to be really up. It drives citizens crazy, drives away tourists. It's been devastating for small businesses during this COVID year. I read recently that burglaries are up 270% in the Richmond district, which is kind of mind-blowing just in the first couple of months of this year. And I'm wondering what you think what can be done, and what will your office be doing to try to address this issue that makes us all so crazy?
Yeah, well, let me provide a little context, Warren. I mean, absolutely, property crime is and has been kind of the biggest nuisance in San Francisco when it comes to public safety for years. When I was on the campaign trail in 2019, the hot topic, not just that year, but for several years prior, was auto burglaries, as you mentioned, smash and grabs. Huge impact on tourism, on hotel businesses, on Union Square, retailers. And this year, in the context of COVID-19, we've seen really significant changes in criminal behavior for lots of reasons. One of the things we saw was a historic decline in many categories of crime. And so I want to address your question. I want to talk about burglaries in particular, but I think it's really important when we have these conversations, just like we talked about with the kind of sensationalism around an individual high-profile case. All too often, the way that public discourse is shaped through media and through community conversations around crime and public safety is to focus on whichever category of crime is up, without a more holistic view. So I want to put into the chat a link to the San Francisco Police Department crime dashboard. I hope folks are able to access this link. I'm putting it in now. This is not my data. This is the San Francisco Police Department's data based on reported crime trends. And you can toggle it by district, you can toggle it by date, compare different time periods from one year to the prior year. But what you'll see is, if you look at the first 2 months of 2021 compared to the pre-pandemic first 2 months of 2020, crime is actually down overall by a historic margin, by 30%. Reported rapes down 60%, reported robberies down 26%, reported auto burglaries and shoplifting thefts down 52%. So yes, there are categories of crime that are going up. And yes, we need to do a better job, and we are focused on that, and I want to talk about what we're doing. But it's important to remember that crime overall is down by historic margins. I'm not taking credit for that. I want to be clear. We know what's driving these changes. What's driving the changes is stores are closed, tourism is shut down, people aren't leaving their homes, they're not in positions where they are exposed to being robbed in the first place. And as a result, people who commit crimes, who earn their livings illegitimately by committing crimes, are changing their criminal behavior. Instead of going into stores and shoplifting, instead of going to Alamo Square and breaking tourist car windows, now they're breaking into garages or businesses that are closed after dark. So the surge or the increase that we see in reported crimes is in some ways, predictable result of changing crime trends based on the pandemic. They are trends that we see by and large across the country that are not specific to San Francisco or policies that I or Chief Scott or the mayor or the Board of Supervisors have implemented. Now, let me just take a step back and talk about how the criminal justice process works in a little more detail and what my office's role is in it. When a crime occurs, we hope that people will call 911 and report it, victims or witnesses. When they do report it, the San Francisco Police Department, in most instances, sometimes the Highway Patrol or BART police, respond and investigate. They are the primary investigating law enforcement agencies for San Francisco, not the DA's office. We don't hear about crimes. We don't know they occurred until and unless the investigating agency, usually SFPD, solves a case and brings us their investigation and says, here's the person we believe committed this crime. Here's the evidence we think you should prosecute. That's the stage when we get involved. That's the very first time we get involved. So in order for us to prosecute the kinds of cases that you referenced, Warren, say the garage burglaries in Richmond, we first need the police to bring us cleared cases, cases that they clear, meaning cases that they solve. So I want to give you another link to a police data dashboard. The first one showed reported crime. This one shows the clearance rates, the rate at which police are actually solving cases and bringing them to us to prosecute. And what you'll see is that burglaries across the city this year are only being cleared at a rate of about 8%. In other words, 92% of reported burglaries never result in an arrest or a case being presented to my office for prosecution. That's a massive decline in the clearance rate from the same first 2 months last year. It's about a 45% decline in police solving cases. The clearance rate in Richmond this year is actually even lower. And you can toggle on that link by individual police station if you want to, and look at specific stations and specific dates. But the challenge that we have is we can't prosecute cases if they're not solved by the investigating agency. Burglaries in the Richmond district this year are being solved at a rate of less than 6%. So I'm not saying this to be critical of the police. I want to be very clear. There is no city in the country where police solve 100% of reported crime. And the police in 2020 and the beginning of 21 have been facing really unique and historic challenges, right? Everybody's wearing masks. How do you identify a suspect, even if you have video footage, when everybody is wearing masks? Police have been under tremendous political pressure in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. All of our budgets have been under pressure. My office is staffed, for example. Our budget allows for staffing at the lowest level of any point since 2015, right? And police are under pressure as well on budget and staffing. So there are real challenges that we collectively face, but I want to be very clear about the limits of what I can do. I cannot prosecute someone if police are unable to solve the case.
Thank you, Chesa. And one of the ways in which we sort of took away flexibility from prosecutors was Proposition 47, which voters passed by, I think, about a 60-40 majority in 2014. And it did a lot of really wonderful things, including ending three strikes penalties. But one of the changes that it made is that it took sort of lower level theft crimes, I guess sort of lower value theft crimes that formerly were treated as felonies or as wobblers and made them misdemeanors. And I'm wondering whether, the increase in property crime in this city seems to at least have directionally been affected around the same time or sort of gone up at the same time. And I'm wondering whether you think that that's something that prosecutors ought to have more flexibility to treat those as felonies, not to, throw first-time offenders behind bars for 5 years, but to take people who are serial property thieves who know exactly where the property limit is and keep keep their crime at a level where it has to be charged as a misdemeanor. Do you think that's something that we ought to consider changing from a policy perspective?
So Prop 47, as you mentioned, basically converted a number of felony theft cases and drug possession cases into misdemeanors. It took away, as you said, the discretion that prosecutors have to charge some of those cases as felonies. It says they have to be charged as misdemeanors. And there's been a tremendous amount of conversation locally and across the state about Prop 47. It was, in essence, back on the ballot in November because many of the police unions around the state wanted voters to repeal Prop 47. And so it appeared on our ballots this past November in the form of Proposition 20. And voters across the state rejected the effort to repeal Prop 47 in really massive numbers. About 62% of voters across the state, and a higher number in San Francisco, voted not to repeal Prop 47. This is an issue where I think the voters have it right and local policy implementation has it wrong. And I'll tell you why. There's great empirical data, really good research studies that show Prop 47 has contributed to a decline in crime statewide. San Francisco may be the outlier in some ways, although again, remember that crime is down by historic margins this year in 2020, notwithstanding a lot of the news coverage we see. So this year is a bit of an outlier because of the pandemic. It is a good question and one that we need to come up with a good answer to, why property crime seems to be on the rise in San Francisco in the wake of Prop 47, even as property crime and other crimes have declined statewide in the wake of Prop 47. I have a number of theories and hypotheses, and we're working really hard in my office and in partnership with the police and others to come up with ways to more effectively address the kind of repeat behavior that you described.
Like what? What are the changes?
Sure. So one example is we have a number of collaborative courts, like drug court, young adult court, like veterans court, where we take people who have committed crimes, usually nonviolent crimes or lower level violent crimes, and we give them really intense supervision and case management, and we give them a kind of a carrot and stick approach. So we say to them, if you engage with case management and if you engage with the programming, which is really intensely supervised by a judge and a case manager and a prosecutor from my office, we will either dismiss the charges against you or reduce them in severity. If you don't, you're going back into criminal court, and we're going to know by virtue of your failure to engage that non-prison or non-jail alternatives are not going to work for you. So we have a bunch of courts like that are really tailored to particular issues: young people, veterans, people with substance issues, people with mental health issues. Those are some of the things we're doing in San Francisco. We also have a neighborhood court program where we take primarily first offenders or folks with limited criminal history, and we send them to they're called neighborhood courts, but they're community adjudicators. They're volunteers from the community who oversee the process. It's parallel to the traditional criminal courts. So we give people an opportunity to really see the harm that they're causing, to do community service, to give back. And if they don't abide by what they're asked to do, if they don't successfully satisfy the community about the harm they've caused and making it right, then again, they get kicked over to the criminal courts for traditional prosecution. So we are thinking outside the box about ways to hold people accountable from everything ranging from petty theft all the way up to far more serious crimes.
And you know, I can appreciate the ways in which that could be really effective for a first-time offender, for somebody who's, you know, stolen something from a neighbor. When you've got the guy who's going, you know, sort of walking down the street, peering into cars, figuring out which ones have an iPad in them, smashing the windows, you know, hauling off a dozen of these a week. Do you think that can work? Do you think that sort of, I'll call it restorative justice or neighborhood court system could work versus, you know, being able to have the flexibility, as we described, to charge a felony when somebody's, you know, even if it were a felony for repeat theft of a certain lower dollar amount?
Sure. Let me just correct a common misconception. Any auto burglary, regardless of dollar value at issue, is and can be charged as a felony. So one of the really common misconceptions we heard on the campaign trail in 2019 was that Prop 47 prevents us from prosecuting auto burglaries as felonies. That's not true. Even if there's no damage done to the car and nothing stolen, an auto burglary can and usually is charged as a felony by my office. And we prosecute somewhere upwards of 80% of auto burglaries that were given by police. We sent someone to state prison before my tenure, but in January of 2019, there was a repeat offender who was convicted of a single auto burglary, a single backpack stolen, single car window broken, and he was sent to state prison for 9 years. So I think there's this myth that we're not punishing people severely enough in San Francisco. That may be true in some cases. And certainly when we see people released and reoffend, we feel that way. But I can give you dozens and dozens of examples of very severe punishment that's been imposed. I see Eric Sapphire waving his hand. I imagine some of his clients have been on the receiving end of some of those severe punishments. So there's no question, Warren, that we can do a better job, and we're trying every day to do that. But it's not obvious which cases or which punishments are effective. And let me give you another example, another really important one that's close to home for me and for all of us in San Francisco. Many of you will have read about another high-profile case that we didn't talk about yet, a case involving a defendant named Jerry Lyons, who tragically, driving a stolen car while we believe he was high on methamphetamines, crashed into a jogger, a young man from Kenya, the same country where my wife's family fled to when they left Lithuania, fleeing the pogroms 100 years ago, and where her father still lives. This young man had just moved to San Francisco. He had a 3-year-old son. He was out exploring his new neighborhood, and the car hit him at a high speed, and he died. Jerry Lyons, the man we are prosecuting for gross vehicular manslaughter, had only recently been released from state prison, where he had served a 4-year sentence. You know what his crime of commitment was, the crime that he was convicted of that led him to get a 4-year state prison sentence from my office? Grand theft. Now, normally the maximum punishment for a theft as a felony is 3 years, as I know Michael Gaines and Eric Sapphire, among others, are well aware. But a extra year was added on because of his criminal history. And so we gave him a 4-year sentence. And the fact that after his release from a 4-year sentence, more than the traditional maximum punishment, in the 6 or 8 months between when he was released and when this devastating tragedy occurred, he didn't meet with his probation officer once, not a single time. He was arrested in multiple counties, 3 counties. And evidently, whatever we did as a state during the 4 years that he was serving his sentence did not address his serious addiction to drugs, did not address the underlying issues. And I'll tell you, I spoke with some of our city's leadership from the neighborhood that Mr. Lyons grew up in. He's a San Francisco native. Turns out both of his parents, like mine, were incarcerated. Turns out his parents were addicted to drugs. And somewhere along the way, Mr. Lyons didn't have the opportunities or the second chances that I had. Somewhere along the way, maybe because of his skin color or his poverty, we collectively gave up on him. And by sending him to prison for the maximum possible sentence without thinking about the drug addiction that had led him to commit that theft, the same drug addiction that tragically took a life at Lake Merced, we set ourselves up. We simply delay the inevitable. We need to do a more effective job at attacking the root causes of crime. What's motivating people's behavior? And I'll tell you, in San Francisco, it's not a secret. 75% of people booked into county jail are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And our jail has become the #1 provider of behavioral health services in this city. We've got to do a better job when we have people who've been arrested at changing their behavior and holding them accountable.
I want to ask you to, if you have the opportunity to put into the chat, I've gotten both sort of directly during this and before this, people who have, very specific concerns, very specific events that they feel like are not getting the attention from the district attorney's office. And I want to ask you to sort of share with us, for people who are in those situations and feel like they aren't getting the support as victims of crime from your office, what's the best way? Do you have an email address that people can email you, or someone on your staff who can help with that?
Absolutely. First of all, let me say, most of the time when we hear about frustrations with individual criminal cases, the case was never presented to us. Most of the time, the very first time I hear about the case is when I get an email from a constituent, from a victim of crime. One of my proposals in our budget this year is a dramatic expansion of my office's victim services team. I want to have advocates, victim advocates, who correspond with victims of property crime, not just violent crime. I want to have a 24/7 hotline so that victims of crime can call and get answers to their questions about what to expect from the process, about how they can get restitution orders if they've suffered financial losses, and more. My victim services team is almost entirely funded by grants. It is time for the city to put its money where its mouth is when it comes to supporting victims of crime. We are ready and willing to provide the support, but we need the city to provide us with the resources. Grants will only go so far, and grants are basically only willing to fund work for victims of violent crime. But as you said, Warren, property crime is the driving issue in this city. We need property crime victim advocates. We're asking the mayor and the board of supervisors for that this year, and I very much hope that they are willing to fund more victim services work. In the short term, email me. I'll put my email in the chat. Email me directly. This is my personal email. If you have a question about a particular case, send me an email. I promise you I'll get back to you within 24 hours. It may take longer than that, depending on the details, for me to track them down. but I will respond to your email. I'll let you know what's happening in your case. I'll tell you who in my office you can correspond with to get more information. And I'll tell you, this happened at a recent community meeting. I'll just tell you a quick story. This happened at a recent community meeting. Oh, my wife is just home. She's going to join us. I hope you don't mind. Hey, Valerie. Hey, at a recent community meeting in District 3, I was speaking with Supervisor Peskin and Police Chief Scott, among others, and a number of merchants in the Union Square Business Improvement District had suffered very serious financial losses during the looting that occurred in May. And I had a follow-up meeting with some of them where they gave us a list of stores that have been targeted. And we went through. One of my staff members, who is a member, I believe, of Congregation Emmanuel here in the city, took the time to go through and research more than 50 different suspects in dozens of different incidents affecting Union Square businesses. And what we found is that in the majority of those instances, the suspect had not been identified or arrested. And in others, we successfully prosecuted, secured felony convictions. In others, the case was still pending. And in one of them, we found that for some reason, the suspect had been cited by the police and never appeared on our court calendar. And so my assistant district attorney, because the victim came to us and said, hey, what happened in this case? We never saw it. It never appeared on our radar. We never got the police report. It never hit the court calendar. But there's enough evidence, we believe, to prove a felony was committed. And so my assistant district attorney, I think he's with us on the call tonight, is working with one of my district attorney investigators, and they're going to write an arrest warrant, and we're going to initiate felony charges in that case. If you reach out to us, we will do whatever it takes, whatever we can within our resources and within the law to seek justice in your case. We want to hear about it, and we want to do justice by you and by all of San Francisco.
I want to ask you one last question as a trial lawyer. Are you going to as the
I can't, Warren, I'm not able to hear you. Are other people able to hear him?
I think I may have just bounced back. Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yes.
Yeah, the question I was going to ask you was a trial lawyer question.
Oh, good. My favorite kind.
Which is, are you going to, Kamala Harris and George Gascon took some criticism for not trying cases themselves. Are you going to try cases as the district attorney, and what kind of cases will you look to try?
Well, it's funny. It's good timing. My wife just got home. She fell in love with me watching me try cases, and she knows how much I enjoy being in the courtroom and doing the trial work that many of us on this call do for a living. It's certainly true that my current job doesn't allow as much time as I would like to be in the courtroom. But unlike my predecessors, I have already done a tremendous amount of work in court, including taking an old murder case to the grand jury and securing an indictment. That's not something that my predecessors did. It isn't quite the same as a jury trial to verdict, but it is very close. And I look forward to doing more grand jury indictments and hopefully trying a case at some point if my schedule allows. I was planning on doing an arraignment calendar tomorrow afternoon. I've done a number of those since the pandemic started, but then the Board of Supervisors asked me to testify all afternoon. So that sort of thing does tend to interfere with my ability to go to court, but I will certainly continue to run courtroom calendars myself and hopefully to try a case. I'll certainly seek to secure a grand jury indictment in at least one case a year going forward.
I'm going to turn you back over in just a moment to Rabbi Jessica Graff, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, District Attorney Chesa Boudin, for being with us today. And I really particularly enjoyed and appreciated your comments at the beginning about your Jewish upbringing and sort of how that factored into your, sort of who you are today. My son is going to be bar mitzvah later this year. His parsha, his Torah portion for his bar mitzvah is justice shall you pursue, which is about as good as it gets in my view. So thank you so much for being here and for answering all these questions and sharing the evening with us. I'll hand it over to Rabbi Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to close this by adding my enormous thanks to you, Chesa, for being with us and answering some challenging questions as we all worry about and care about this city that we call home. We really look forward to welcoming you and Valerie to Congregation Sherith Israel. I don't know if you've ever been in our gorgeous sanctuary, but we're very proud of this community. And as soon as we can be back together, we hope you'll be here with us in person. Thank you so much to Warren Braunig for this incredible interview and keeping us really on target with so many different topics that we wanted to cover tonight, and to Michael for bringing this wonderful event to us. Thank you to all of you for being here. I want to let you know that the next From the Front Lines conversation will take place 2 weeks from tonight on Wednesday, March, is that 10th? I think I don't have a calendar in front of me. And it will be, yes, Karen saying, yes, the Social Action Committee is actually, Karen, Gordon, can you unmute Karen for 1 minute? I will let her tell us what the next event will be, and stay tuned. You'll get lots of information about this in the coming emails. So just a quick note from the co-chair of our Social Action Committee, Karen Altschuler.
Okay. Be sure to join us March 10th from 5 to 6 for a conversations from the front line, immigrants, refugees, and the challenges ahead. And I'll be interviewing Deborah Lee, Reverend Deborah Lee, who is the leader of the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. It's one of our partners in the work we do with individuals and activity advocacy. And the other is Joe Goldman from HIAS, the Western Office of HIAS. So they'll be talking in a very deeply engaged and informed way about immigrants and refugees. And on the Shabbat just before that, on the 5th, the CEO of HIAS will be speaking, will be doing the sermon at that service. So join us. It'll be a week of discussion and things to learn.
Lots of great things coming up. Thank you all so much, and good night to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.